The man who owned the city skyline stood alone in the rain, a sentinel at the grave of the woman who owned his heart. Dawson Pierce, a name whispered in boardrooms and etched onto skyscrapers, was rendered powerless by a slab of Vermont marble. For 1 year, this had been his ritual, a silent, solitary communion with memory. But today, the ritual was broken. Through the weeping grey curtain of the storm, he saw her, a young woman, thin and shivering, her hands pressed to the cold stone of his wife's grave. She wasn't family. She wasn't a friend he knew. She was a stranger, and she was crying with a grief so raw it mirrored the chasm in his own soul. Who was she? And why was she mourning his wife with the intimacy of a secret keeper? The rain fell on Crestview Cemetery with a soft, percussive rhythm, a melancholic drumbeat against the granite and marble kingdom of the dead. It was a Thursday. Laura had always hated rainy Thursdays. Dawson Pierce smiled faintly at the memory, the expression a fleeting ghost on his chiseled face. The smile didn't reach his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, and had been for exactly 365 days. His custom-made Italian leather shoes, each costing more than a month's rent for most people, were speckled with mud. He didn't care. His Savile Row suit was darkening at the shoulders with rain. He didn't feel it. His world had shrunk from global markets and corporate conquests to this 6-by-8-foot plot of manicured grass. Here lay Laura Bennett Pierce, his wife, his anchor, his everything, taken by a slick road, a blind corner, and a speeding truck a year ago today. The official report was cold, clinical. It did nothing to explain the silence in their sprawling penthouse, the other half of the bed that remained eternally cool. Dawson's mausoleum for her was a testament to both his wealth and his grief. It was less a tombstone and more a small, neoclassical temple of polished white marble, with her name inscribed in elegant, understated gold lettering. It was absurdly grand, an ostentatious monument to a woman who preferred wildflower fields to gilded ballrooms. He knew she would have gently chided him for it, a playful glint in her sapphire eyes. "Dawson, darling," she would have said, her voice like warm honey. "It's a bit much, don't you think? I only needed a small patch of earth and a nice view." The thought was so clear he almost turned, expecting to see her standing there. But there was only the rain and the silence. His weekly visits were a sacred, inviolable routine. His security detail, a pair of discreet men in a black sedan, knew to stay at the cemetery gates. No one disturbed him here. This was his space, his time, until today. Through the mist that clung to the ancient oak trees, he saw a figure, a slight, feminine shape, huddled before Laura's mausoleum. At first, he felt a prickle of irritation. This was his sanctuary. Had the tabloids found him? Was this some ghoulish reporter looking for a scoop on the grieving billionaire? He strode forward, his long legs eating up the damp ground, his jaw set in a hard line, ready to unleash the cold fury that had become his default emotion. As he drew closer, however, the anger dissolved, replaced by a profound confusion. This was no reporter. The woman was young, perhaps in her early 20s. Her hair, a simple brown ponytail, was plastered to her head and neck by the downpour. She wore a thin, pale blue Waitress uniform, the fabric soaked through and clinging to her slender frame. Her shoes were worn-out sneakers, the kind that offered no defense against the puddles forming around her. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the force of her sobs. They were ragged, guttural sounds of pure, unadulterated pain. Her hands were pressed flat against the marble, right over Laura's name, as if trying to feel a heartbeat through the stone. Dawson stopped a few feet away, hidden by the shadow of a weeping angel statue. He watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. He had seen people cry at funerals. He had seen the performative grief of business acquaintances and the polite, distant sorrow of old family friends. This was different. This was the kind of grief he felt in the dead of night when the silence was too loud to bear. It was a personal, intimate agony. Who was she? He ran through the mental Rolodex of Laura's friends, charity acquaintances, and distant relatives. This girl fit nowhere. Laura had chaired boards, attended galas, and her circle was one of sophisticated, well-heeled individuals. This girl looked like she counted her tips at the end of a long shift to see if she could afford a taxi home. He watched for another 5 minutes as she wept, her shoulders shaking. Finally, she seemed to exhaust herself. She sagged against the tomb, her forehead resting on the cold marble. She whispered something, a single word lost to the wind and rain. Dawson decided to act. He stepped out from behind the statue. The crunch of his shoe on a gravel path made her flinch. She spun around, her eyes wide with alarm. They were stunning eyes, a clear, startling hazel, but they were red-rimmed and bloodshot, swimming in tears. Her face was pale and drawn, but possessed a natural, unassuming beauty. Fear was etched onto it now, mixed with embarrassment at being caught in such a vulnerable state. She looked at his expensive suit, his severe expression, and her gaze dropped to the ground. She looked like a startled fawn cornered by a wolf. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll go." She started to sidle away, clutching the strap of a worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Wait." Dawson's voice was deeper, rougher than he intended. It was the voice he used to command boardrooms, and it made her freeze in place. He softened his tone, a skill he hadn't used in a year. "You're not intruding. I have to ask, how did you know my wife?" The girl's eyes flickered from his face to the name on the tomb and back again. A fresh wave of tears welled. "I didn't," she whispered, hugging herself as a gust of wind cut through her thin uniform. "Not really. Not in person." Dawson's brows furrowed. "Then why are you here? Why are you crying like this?" The question felt invasive, but the mystery was a hook in his soul, pulling him out of the fog of his own sorrow. She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. She seemed to be having an internal battle, weighing fear against some other, stronger emotion. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "Your wife, Mrs. Pierce. She changed my life. She saved me. She saved my family." Dawson was completely lost. "Saved you? How? Laura never mentioned you. What's your name?" "Natalie. Natalie Rowe." She said it simply, as if the name meant nothing. And to him, it didn't. He had never heard it before. "Ms. Rowe," Dawson said, his voice regaining some of its formal edge. "My wife's charitable contributions were a matter of public record. She was very generous to the Children's Hospital, the Arts Foundation, but it was all handled through the Pierce Foundation. There were no private arrangements. I would have known." Natalie shook her head, a defiant spark entering her gaze. "No, this wasn't public. It wasn't the Pierce Foundation. It was just her." She fumbled with the clasp on her wet bag, her fingers clumsy with cold. She pulled out a Ziploc bag. Inside, protected from the rain, were a few folded pieces of paper. She carefully extracted one, a letter printed on simple, cream-colored stationery. The letterhead was blank. She held it out to him. Dawson hesitated, then took it. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Laura's elegant, flowing script, a cursive that was as much art as it was writing. The letter was dated 2 years ago. My dearest Nightingale, I received your last report card. Straight A's. I am bursting with pride. I knew you had it in you. Your art teacher's note about your portfolio was particularly wonderful. The world needs more beauty, and you have a gift for creating it. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. I've enclosed the check for this semester's tuition at the community college. Please, do not worry about the amount. Your only job is to focus on your studies and to keep soaring. Remember our deal. You study hard, and you make something beautiful. That is all the repayment I will ever need. Stay strong. Keep flying. Yours, a friend. Dawson read it twice, then a third time. Nightingale? A friend? He looked from the letter to the girl, Natalie, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She called you Nightingale? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Natalie nodded, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. It was her name for me. I don't know why. I never got to ask. Her voice cracked. She sponsored my college courses. She paid for my little brother's asthma medication when my mum's insurance wouldn't cover it. Once, when our landlord was going to evict us, she anonymously paid 3 months of our back rent. It all came through a P.O. box in letters just like that one. I never knew who she was. Just a friend. Dawson felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. This was a side of Laura he had never known. He was the billionaire philanthropist, the one who wrote the 7-figure checks at galas while the cameras flashed. He thought he had been the engine of their charitable work. But this was different. This was secret, personal, and deeply intimate. It was purely Laura. How did you find out it was her? He asked, the question heavy with 1,000 others. After the accident, Natalie said, her gaze drifting back to the mausoleum. The letters stopped. The checks stopped. I was so worried. I thought maybe my friend had gotten sick or fallen on hard times. I didn't know what to do. Then, about a month ago, I was at the library, looking through old newspapers for a history project, and I saw an article about the 1-year anniversary of the crash. It had a picture of her. And it mentioned her charity work, her love for the arts, and her support for education. She paused, taking another shaky breath. But the thing that made me sure was a little detail at the end. It said her favorite poem was Ode to a Nightingale. It all just clicked. The timing, the kindness, the name she gave me. It had to be her. Dawson stood motionless, the rain forgotten. Laura had loved that poem. She would read it aloud to him on quiet evenings, her voice filling their sterile, modern home with a warmth it otherwise lacked. He had seen it as a quaint, romantic quirk. He never imagined it was a key to a secret life she was leading, a life she had hidden, even from him. Why? Was she afraid he would disapprove? That he would try to systematize it, to fold her personal acts of kindness into the cold machinery of the Pierce Foundation? The thought shamed him. He probably would have. He saw efficiency and impact. She saw a single person who needed help. So I found the cemetery records online, Natalie continued, pulling him from his thoughts. I had to come. I had to say thank you. And I had to say, I'm sorry. Sorry for what? Dawson asked, his voice softer now. That I didn't get to finish, she said, her voice thick with regret. The deal was that I would study hard and make something beautiful. I had to drop out of my art program when the money stopped. I work full-time at the diner now to support my brother. I haven't picked up a paintbrush in months. I feel like I failed her. The sheer, earnest sincerity of her words struck Dawson harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. In his world, people were driven by profit, by ambition, by ego. This girl, shivering in the rain, was driven by a promise made to a ghost. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but underneath it, a fierce, resilient spirit. The same spirit Laura had obviously seen. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect it, to honor his wife's secret legacy. This girl, Natalie Rowe, was the last project Laura had started, and he would be damned if he let it fail. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, black titanium wallet. He bypassed the cash and extracted a business card. It was simple, stark white, with his name, Dawson Pierce, and a single phone number engraved in black. No title, no company name. It was his private, direct line, a number known to less than a dozen people in the world. He held it out to her. "This is my personal number, Ms. Rowe. I want you to call me tomorrow. We're going to talk about your tuition. We're going to talk about your brother's medication. We're going to finish what my wife started." Natalie stared at the card as if it were a burning coal. She didn't take it. I can't. I don't want your money, Mr. Pierce. I just wanted to pay my respects." "This isn't about my money," Dawson said, his tone firm but not unkind. "This is about my wife's wish. You said it yourself. The deal was you would make something beautiful. Laura made an investment in you. I intend to see it through. Consider me the executor of her will in this matter." He pushed the card gently into her hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Call me, please." She finally closed her fingers around the card, her hazel eyes searching his face for a trick, a catch. She found none. All she saw was a man whose grief was as vast and empty as the sky above them, but in his eyes, for the first time, was a flicker of something new, a spark of purpose. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll call." "Good," he said with a nod. He then turned his gaze back to the mausoleum, to the cold marble that separated him from his wife. "Thank you for telling me," he said, more to the tomb than to Natalie. "Thank you for showing me this." When he turned back, she was gone, having slipped away as quietly as she arrived, a ghost of a girl leaving only the imprint of an impossible story on the landscape of his grief. Dawson Pierce stood alone once more, but for the first time in a year, the silence of the cemetery felt different. It was no longer just an echo of his loss. Now, it held a secret and a promise. The next 24 hours were a study in contrasts. For Natalie Rowe, they were a blur of grease-scented air, clattering plates, and the constant, wearying ache in her feet. The Morning Glory diner was a classic slice of Americana, perpetually smelling of stale coffee and bacon. It was her reality. She refilled coffee for truckers named Sal and flirted half-heartedly with college boys for better tips, all while the impossible business card felt like a small, rectangular fire in her pocket. Her apartment was a tiny two-bedroom she shared with her 10-year-old brother, Leo. It was on the 4th floor of a walk-up with perpetually flickering hallway lights and the lingering smell of boiled cabbage from Mrs. Henderson in 2B. That night, after her shift, she found Leo at the small kitchen table, hunched over a drawing, his inhaler sitting next to his elbow like a loyal sidekick. He was sketching a superhero, a magnificent figure with a flowing cape and a symbol on his chest that looked suspiciously like a nightingale. "Hey, buddy," she said, forcing a cheerfulness she didn't feel as she dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. "What's Captain Nightingale up to tonight?" Leo didn't look up, his concentration absolute. "He's fighting the smog monster that tries to steal people's breath," he said, his voice small but serious. The drawing was surprisingly good. He had a natural talent, an eye for line and form that she recognized with a painful pang of longing. It was the same talent her art teacher had praised in her. She heated up leftover spaghetti, and they ate in comfortable silence. The billionaire's card was a silent scream from her pocket. Who was she to call Dawson Pierce? A man who lived in a different universe. To him, her entire life's financial struggles were probably a rounding error. It felt like a trap, a rich man's fleeting whim. He was grieving. Maybe he'd wake up the next morning and regret his grand gesture, resentful of the intrusion. But then she looked at Leo, who had started wheezing slightly after eating, a common occurrence. She looked at the peeling paint on the walls, the stack of bills on the counter, held down by a salt shaker. She thought of Laura Pierce's letter. Keep flying. She wasn't flying. She was barely treading water. Laura had believed in her. Maybe just for a moment, she had to believe in her husband, too. For Dawson Pierce, the 24 hours were spent in a world of silent, air-conditioned luxury that felt more like a prison than a paradise. His penthouse, occupying the top 2 floors of the Pierce Tower, was a monument to minimalist design. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city he owned, but all he saw was a grid of indifferent lights. Laura had filled this place with art, with flowers, with laughter. Now, it was as silent as her tomb. He didn't go to the office. He cancelled his meetings, ignoring the flurry of concerned texts and emails from his COO, Gideon Shaw. Gideon was more than an employee. He was an old friend, the one who had been with him since they were 2 ambitious kids in a garage, dreaming of building an empire. It was Gideon who had managed everything after Laura's death, shielding Dawson from the worst of the corporate and legal fallout, allowing him to grieve. He was the rock Dawson had leaned on. Dawson sat in his study, a room panelled in dark mahogany, with Laura's letter to Natalie on the desk in front of him. He stared at her handwriting, tracing the loops and curves with his finger. A secret life. A whole world of kindness and connection she had built without him. Why? The shame he'd felt at the cemetery returned, sharper this time. He remembered conversations, fragments of moments he had dismissed. Laura, a few years back, suggesting they create a special fund, a discretionary angel fund, as she'd called it, for small, direct impact cases the foundation was too cumbersome to handle. "We have the Pierce Foundation, Laura," he'd said, barely looking up from a quarterly report. "It's one of the largest in the state. It does incredible work. Let's not complicate things with unofficial side projects. It's messy, inefficient." He could see her face now in his memory, the brief flicker of disappointment quickly masked by a smile. "Of course, darling, you're right. It's just a silly idea." It wasn't a silly idea. She had just gone and done it herself, without his money, without his name. She must have used her personal allowance, the funds from her own family inheritance he'd always insisted she keep separate. He felt a profound sense of loss that had nothing to do with her death, but with his own blindness during her life. He hadn't really seen her, not all of her. At noon the next day, his private line, a phone that rarely rang, chimed. The sound was jarring in the quiet apartment. He picked it up on the first ring. "Hello? Mr. Pierce?" The voice was small, hesitant. It's Natalie Rowe, from the cemetery." A wave of relief washed over Dawson, so potent it surprised him. "Ms. Rowe, Natalie, I'm glad you called." I don't want to be a bother," she began, the words rushing out. "I know you're a busy man, and maybe yesterday, with the rain and the anniversary, maybe you said things you didn't mean, and that's okay, I understand." "I meant every word," he cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. "Laura made you a promise. I'm going to honor it. Can you meet me?" "In 1 hour." He suggested a small, independent coffee shop in a quiet neighborhood, far from the financial district and his usual haunts. It was the kind of place Laura would have loved. When he arrived, dressed down in dark jeans and a simple grey cashmere sweater, he saw Natalie already seated at a small table in the corner, nervously shredding a napkin. She looked different out of the rain and her work uniform. She was wearing jeans and a simple, clean white t-shirt. Her hair was dry and fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked younger and even more out of her depth. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding into the chair opposite her. "I almost didn't," she admitted, not meeting his eyes. "This is crazy." "The craziest things are often the most important," he replied, a platitude that sounded surprisingly sincere. He ordered 2 coffees, and for a few awkward moments they sat in silence. "Tell me everything," he finally said. "Start from the beginning. Tell me about the first letter." And so she did. She told him about being a senior in high school, a promising art student with a scholarship offer to a prestigious art institute. And then her father had died suddenly from a heart attack, leaving them with a mountain of medical debt. Her mother had to work 2 jobs, and Natalie had given up her scholarship to work to help keep them afloat. Then her mother had gotten sick, a chronic illness that drained their savings. That's when the first letter arrived, an anonymous check for $500 with a note that said, "Sometimes a little help is all we need." The letters and the money kept coming, sporadically, always when things were at their most desperate. It paid for Leo's first nebulizer. It covered the cost of a community college art program, so she wouldn't lose her skills. It was a lifeline from an anonymous angel she called the Friend, who in turn called her Nightingale. As she spoke, Dawson saw the portrait of his wife deepen, gain new colors, new textures. This was the woman he fell in love with, the one who would stop the car to help a stranded motorist, the one who knew the names of every staff member in their building. A part of her, he thought, had been subsumed by his world of corporate largesse, had simply gone underground, operating in secret. "She gave me this too," Natalie said, her voice dropping. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, well-loved book. It was a slim volume of poetry. Keats. She opened it to the inside cover. In Laura's handwriting, it said, "To my Nightingale. Never be afraid of the dark. That's when you can see the stars." Dawson's breath caught in his throat. It was an old family saying of hers, something her grandmother used to tell her. But underneath the inscription was something else, a small, almost invisible doodle in the margin, next to the binding. It looked like a simple sketch of a bird in flight, but one wing was shaped oddly, more like a key, and next to it a series of numbers, written so faintly they were barely there. 48 solar 8,584 DGN, 2.929 degree. "What are these numbers?" he asked, pointing. Natalie squinted. "I don't know. I always thought it was just a smudge or a doodle. I never really paid it any mind." Dawson pulled out his phone. He was a man of data, of patterns, of information. Numbers meant something. He typed them into a map search. The result that flashed on his screen made the air leave his lungs. Eiffel Tower, Paris. "Paris?" Natalie breathed, leaning over to see his phone. Why would she write coordinates for the Eiffel Tower in a book she gave me? "Our honeymoon," Dawson whispered, his mind racing. "Our first trip together. We stood at the top of the Eiffel Tower. She said she felt like she was on top of the world." He looked at the book, then at Natalie, and suddenly the pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed began to slide into place. This wasn't just about secret charity. A doodle, coordinates, a code name. It felt like something more, something clandestine. "Natalie," he said, his voice low and urgent. "My wife. In the weeks before she died, was she different? Did she seem worried? Preoccupied?" Natalie's brow furrowed in thought. "I never met her. I wouldn't know." Then her eyes widened. "But the last letter, it was different." "Different how?" "It was short, rushed. The handwriting was shaky. It came with a larger check than usual, enough for a whole year's tuition. And the note, it was strange." "What did it say?" Dawson leaned forward, his entire body tense. "It just said, 'I may have to be quiet for a while, little bird. But the song isn't over. If the raven ever tries to steal your nest, use this to build a new one and fly far away.'" I thought she was just being poetic, telling me she was sick or something. Raven, Nightingale. It fit the theme. Raven. A new bird had entered the story, and the timing, a large check, a warning to fly far away, right before her death. A death that had been ruled an accident, a speeding truck on a rainy night, simple, tragic, and unquestioned, until now. Dawson's mind, the same analytical machine that built a tech empire from scratch, began to churn. Laura wasn't just a secret philanthropist. She was sending coded messages. She was scared. Raven, Nightingale, Paris. The pieces were disparate, nonsensical, but they were there. It was a song, and he was only just beginning to hear the melody. He looked at Natalie, this young waitress who had stumbled into the center of his life, and saw her not as a charity case, but as the keeper of the first clue. She was the only living link to Laura's secret world. "I need that last letter, Natalie," he said, his voice steely with resolve. "And I need every other piece of correspondence you ever received from her. Don't tell anyone about this conversation. Don't mention the book, the numbers, or the name Raven to anyone. Can you do that for me?" The fear was back in her eyes, but it was mingled with a dawning understanding that this was bigger than unpaid tuition. She nodded slowly. "Yes, of course." "Good," he said. He took out a pen and wrote an address on a napkin. It was for a private bank in the city centre. "Go here tomorrow. I'm establishing a trust for you. The Nightingale Trust. It will be more than enough to cover your education, your brother's medical needs, and your living expenses. No more Dinah." She started to protest, but he held up a hand. "This is not a gift, Natalie. It's a retainer. I'm hiring you. Your job is to help me figure out what my wife was trying to say. You saw a side of her that I, and the rest of the world, never did. You might be the only person who can help me understand." He stood up, his mind already miles away, connecting dots, searching for patterns. The rainy cemetery felt like a lifetime ago. His grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his chest. But now it was accompanied by something else, a burning, ferocious purpose. Someone, or something, named Raven, had threatened his wife, and Dawson Pierce would tear his own world apart to find out who and why. The investigation into Laura Pierce's life and her death had just begun. The Nightingale Trust was a quiet thunderclap in Natalie's life. One day she was juggling plates and worrying about rent. The next, a discreet bank manager was explaining that her financial anxieties were, for the foreseeable future, obsolete. The sum Dawson had settled into the trust was staggering, an amount she couldn't fully comprehend. It was liberation and a gilded cage all at once. She quit the diner, the relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. But the freedom was tinged with a heavy sense of responsibility and a creeping dread. This wasn't just charity anymore. This was a mission. She met Dawson a few days later, not in a coffee shop, but in a place that felt like stepping into another dimension, the private library of his penthouse. Bookshelves soared 2 stories high, filled with leather-bound volumes. A spiral staircase curled up to a second-level landing. In the center of the room was a massive oak table, and on it, Natalie carefully laid out her entire history with Laura Pierce. There were 12 letters in total, along with the Keats poetry book. Dawson examined each one under a desk lamp, his face a mask of concentration. He arranged them chronologically, scrutinizing the handwriting, the stationery, the postmarks. "Her script gets tighter here," he murmured, pointing to a letter from about 18 months ago. More hurried, still loving, still encouraging, but tense. Natalie, feeling strangely like a detective's apprentice, leaned in. "That was around the time she sent money for a new water heater. Ours had burst. I wrote to the P.O. box, desperate, and she replied almost immediately." "She was reactive," Dawson mused, "responding to your needs. But the last letter, the one that mentions the raven, that was proactive, a warning. Something changed." He turned his attention to the business world he knew so well. "Raven," he said, more to himself than to her. "It's not a person, it's a project." He spent the next 2 days buried in his corporate archives. As CEO, he had top-level access to everything, yet he moved with caution, using back channels and his personal logins late at night, not wanting to raise any flags. The name Raven was a ghost in the system. He finally found it, buried deep in the archives of the Research and Development Division, under a subsidiary company he'd acquired years ago. Project Raven. Officially, it was a data mining initiative focused on predictive market analysis. According to the executive summary, signed off on by his COO, Gideon Shaw, the project had been a failure. It was too ambitious, the algorithm unstable. It had been officially decommissioned and shelved 18 months ago, right around the time Laura's handwriting had become more tense. A coincidence? Dawson didn't believe in them. His next call was to a man named Thomas Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy had been Laura's personal driver and head of her small security detail for over a decade, a stoic man with watchful eyes and an unwavering loyalty to his wife. 6 months after Laura's death, Gideon had personally overseen Abernathy's generous retirement package, citing the man's age and the painful memories associated with his position. At the time, Dawson had seen it as a compassionate gesture from Gideon. Now it seemed sinister. He met Abernathy at a fishing pier an hour outside the city. The old driver looked weathered, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Mr. Pierce," Abernathy greeted him with a respectful but wary nod. "Tom," Dawson said, dispensing with the formality. "I need to ask you about Laura, about the weeks before she died." Abernathy's gaze drifted to the grey water. "I've been waiting for this call for a year, sir." Dawson's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Pierce was scared," Abernathy said, his voice low and gravelly. "She put on a brave face for you, but she was terrified. She had me driving her to strange places, not her usual charities or luncheons, industrial parks, warehouse districts. She'd just have me park a block away and she would watch." "Taking notes." "Notes on what?" "I don't know. But there was one place in particular. A logistics warehouse out by the old port, belongs to a shell corporation, which I later found out is owned by another shell corporation, which is owned by Pierce Dynamics." The pieces were slamming together now with brutal force. "She started carrying a different bag," Abernathy continued. "Not her usual designer purse, a plain heavy satchel. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I was to get that bag and take it to a specific reporter at the Global Times. She wrote the name down for me." "And what happened to the bag after the crash, Tom?" Dawson asked, his voice tight. Abernathy's face hardened with a shame that was clearly not his own. "It was gone. The police report said the first responder on the scene was a corporate security officer from Pierce Dynamics who happened to be nearby. He secured her personal effects. The man was one of Mr. Shaw's appointments. By the time I got to the hospital, all they had was her purse. The satchel was never seen again. Gideon. It was always Gideon. His friend, his confidant, the man who held his company's secrets. It seemed he held Laura's too. Dawson returned to the penthouse, a cold, calculated rage building within him. He now had a location, the warehouse, and a motive taking shape. Project Raven hadn't been a failure. It had been hidden. And Laura had found it. He called Natalie. "I need your eyes," he said, his voice clipped and urgent. "Laura gave you that book for a reason. There's something else there, something we're missing. Look at it again. Look at every page, every mark, every smudge." For hours, Natalie sat at the great oak table, the priceless Keats volume in her hands. She felt the texture of every page, angled it under the light. She looked at the doodle of the bird key and the Paris coordinates. It felt like a dead end. Frustrated, she almost gave up. She remembered what Laura wrote. Never be afraid of the dark. On a whim, she took the book into a windowless powder room, closed the door, and switched on her phone's small flashlight, holding it at an angle to the page, almost parallel. And there, something appeared. The paper in the book was high quality, thick stock, but against the bright, angled light, a faint watermark became visible. It wasn't the publisher's mark. It was a logo, a stylized raven, its wings forming a perfect circle. She gasped. She ran back out to the library. "Dawson, the watermark! It's a raven!" Dawson rushed over. He examined the mark, his eyes blazing with intensity. He recognized it instantly. It was the logo for the decommissioned Project Raven. He'd only seen it once, in the appendix of the report he'd unearthed. "She knew," he breathed. She knew they were connected. The project, the book, her secret charity. It's all one story. But how? How was a data mining project connected to a book of poetry and a waitress from the other side of town? "Wait," Natalie said, her mind racing. "The doodle, the bird with the wing shaped like a key." She picked up a pencil and a piece of paper. "Artists. We learn to see things differently. It's not just a key. Look at the shape." She sketched the odd wing. It had 3 distinct notches along its length and a sharp turn at the end. It wasn't a standard key shape. Dawson stared at it, the image swimming in his vision. Then it hit him. It wasn't a key for a lock. It was a map. He pulled up a satellite view of the warehouse district Abernathy had mentioned. It was a sprawling complex of identical-looking buildings, but one, on the northern edge, was bordered by a disused railway line. He zoomed in. The main building, a loading bay, and a smaller administrative office. The layout, it was a vague approximation of the doodle. "The notches," Natalie said, pointing to the sketch. 1, 2, 3. What if they're landmarks?" Dawson scanned the satellite image. Along the access road to that specific warehouse, there were 3 distinct features: an old water tower, a junction box for the railway, and a solitary large cypress tree that stood out from the low scrub. 3 notches. The sharp turn at the end of the keywing pointed directly at the small administrative office attached to the main warehouse. "That's it," Dawson said, a grim certainty in his voice. "That's where the proof is. Whatever Laura found, whatever she put in that satchel, the source of it is in that office." The plan was insane, but necessary. They couldn't go to the police. Gideon had a man on the scene of the crash. He undoubtedly had contacts inside the force. They were on their own. Dawson, the billionaire CEO, Natalie, the art student waitress, and Abernathy, the retired driver. A trinity of unlikely conspirators bound by their love for one woman. Their objective was clear: get inside that office and find what Laura was willing to die for. As they planned, a shadow fell over Natalie's newfound security. One afternoon, as she was leaving the bank, a sleek black town car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and there sat Gideon Shaw, his smile as polished and predatory as a shark's. "Ms. Rowe," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Gideon Shaw, I'm a colleague of Mr. Pierce's. He's spoken so highly of you." Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs. Hello. "Dawson is a very generous man," Gideon continued, his eyes cold and analytical. "But sometimes his grief makes him impressionable. He can be taken advantage of. I just want you to know that we at the company are keeping a close eye on his interests. All of his interests. It would be a shame if a misunderstanding were to jeopardize your— what is it he calls it? The Nightingale Trust." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in the language of corporate concern. He knew. He knew about the trust, about her connection to Dawson. He was warning her off. Natalie stood her ground, her fear warring with a surge of anger. "Mr. Pierce has been very kind, and his wife was a wonderful person," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Gideon's smile widened. She was indeed a saint. Saints sometimes get involved in things they don't understand. It can be tragic. Drive safely, Miss Rowe. The window slid up, and the car pulled away, leaving Natalie standing on the sidewalk, trembling. The raven had shown its face, and it was far more terrifying than she could have imagined. She now knew this wasn't just about finding justice for Laura. It was about survival. Gideon Shaw's threat was the spark that ignited the fuse. The confrontation was no longer a matter of choice, but of survival. The next afternoon, Natalie was leaving a bookstore when a black town car slid to the curb. The window whispered down, revealing Gideon's polished smile. "Ms. Rowe," he began, his voice a silken menace. "Dawson's generosity is admirable, but his grief makes him impressionable. It would be a tragedy if some misunderstanding were to jeopardize the lovely arrangement he's made for you. Saints, you know, sometimes get involved in things they don't understand. It can be fatal. Drive safely." The car purred away, leaving Natalie trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying anger. The raven had shown its face, and it was time to pull down its nest. The plan was set for Saturday night. Dawson, deploying his formidable technological acumen, mapped the warehouse's digital infrastructure. Abernathy, using decades of surveillance experience, charted the physical blind spots and guard patrols. Natalie's role was to decipher Laura's final message. Poring over the last letter, she found a new clue, overlooked in their haste. The signature was a single, rushed letter, L, and beside it, 4 tiny, precise ink dots, a password clue. It felt vital. Abernathy drove them in a nondescript panel van through the moonless night, the industrial park a desolate landscape of concrete and shadow. From the back of the van, Dawson's laptop became a weapon. With quiet keystrokes, he disarmed the perimeter alarms and security cameras. "We have a 20-minute window before the system sends a remote alert," he stated, his face lit by the screen's green glow. "Let's move." He and Natalie slipped through the darkness towards the small administrative office. The lock on the door yielded to Dawson's tools in under a minute, and they were inside. The air was stale. The office contained only a desk, a computer, and a cheap metal filing cabinet. "The files will be digital," Dawson whispered, heading straight for the computer. He bypassed the login, but was immediately stopped by a wall of military-grade encryption. "It's a fortress. It's asking for a passphrase." He typed in, "Nightingale. Access denied." "10 minutes," he muttered, his jaw tight. Natalie's mind raced, the image of the letter in her mind's eye. L4 dots. "It's not the computer," she said suddenly, her voice resonating with certainty. "The computer is a trap. It's a decoy to waste our time. Gideon would expect you to attack the strongest defense." Her gaze fell upon the flimsy filing cabinet. But Laura, she was smarter. More subtle? She pointed to the cabinet's simple 4-digit combination lock. 4 dots, 4 digits. Dawson stared from the hypersecure computer to the ridiculously simple lock. It was a brilliant misdirection. "The combination?" Natalie's breath hitched as the final piece clicked into place. "Paris. The coordinates she wrote in the book. 2.2945 after OE. It wasn't the location that mattered. It was the numbers. 2945. Dawson knelt, his fingers flying across the dials. He entered the code and pulled. The lock clicked open with startling ease. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath dusty manuals, lay a single, thick, black ledger. On its cover, drawn in silver ink, was a small, elegant nightingale. Laura's mark. Dawson opened it. The pages were filled with her graceful, flowing script. It wasn't a diary of emotions, but a meticulous log of an investigation that made his blood run cold. Project Raven was no mere data mining scheme. It was espionage on a global scale. Gideon had built a secret back door into Pierce Dynamics' most popular product, the Aura personal assistant AI. He had access to the live microphone feeds of millions of devices in homes, cars, and boardrooms. The ledger was a horrifying catalogue of his crimes, names, dates, and offshore accounts where he'd funneled millions, selling sensitive audio of political strategy sessions, corporate negotiations, and private legal calls to the highest bidder. The final entry, dated the day before her death, shattered what was left of Dawson's world. "Gideon knows. He cornered me in the garage today. He didn't threaten me outright, but his eyes, that smile. He is a monster. I'm meeting the reporter from the Global Times tomorrow. The evidence is in my satchel. I pray it's enough. Dawson must never know the truth. It would destroy him to know Gideon, his brother in all but blood, built this empire of filth using his company. I have to do this alone, to protect him. I'm so afraid. But I must be brave, for my Nightingale, for everyone." Dawson closed the ledger, his hands shaking. The grief that had hollowed him out for a year was consumed by a white-hot, righteous fury. The truck crash, the first responder from Gideon's team, the missing satchel, it all coalesced into a single, brutal fact. This was not a betrayal. This was a murder. Gideon had killed the woman he loved to protect his secret. Laura hadn't died to protect a company. She had died to protect him. He looked at Natalie, whose face was pale with shared horror, tears streaming silently for the woman she'd never met. The bond between them solidified in that moment. 2 solitary mourners transformed into agents of retribution. With cold precision, Dawson took out his phone. He photographed every single page of the ledger, the flash illuminating the terrible truth in the darkness. The images uploaded to a secure server only he could access. "Let's go," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, save for a chilling resolve. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was the executor of his wife's final, unwritten will. Laura was worried about a crack in the foundation. "I'm going to bring the whole building down." The fall of Gideon Shaw was not a dramatic courtroom battle, but a swift, brutal corporate execution. The next morning, Dawson called an emergency meeting of the Pierce Dynamics Board of Directors. He walked into the room, silent and grim, and in front of everyone he played a single 3-minute audio file. It was a recording from the hidden microphone in Gideon's own office, captured by the very system he had created. In it, Gideon was negotiating the sale of a senator's private conversations to a foreign lobbyist. The recording had been the final piece of evidence in Laura's ledger. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Gideon's face turned the color of ash. He didn't say a word as security escorted him from the building, directly into the custody of federal agents Dawson had already briefed. The story exploded. Pierce Dynamics was rocked by the scandal, its stock plummeting. But Dawson didn't care about the money or the prestige. He cared about the truth. In the months that followed, he worked tirelessly, not to salvage his reputation, but to transform the company Laura had died to protect. He dismantled the remnants of Raven, established a radical new policy of user privacy that set a new industry standard, and created the public, multi-billion-dollar Laura's Song Foundation, dedicated to transparency, ethical technology, and supporting grassroots heroes like the ones Laura had secretly championed. Natalie Rowe sat on its board of directors. She was no longer a waitress, but a full-time art student at the finest institute in the country, her talent flourishing. She and Leo lived in a comfortable, sunny apartment, his asthma managed, his future bright. She was the foundation's soul, a constant reminder of its purpose. Her relationship with Dawson was one of profound, quiet friendship. There was no whirlwind romance. Their bond was something deeper, forged in grief and cemented in justice. They had saved each other in a way. She had pulled him from the fog of his sorrow, and he had given her the future Laura had dreamed of for her. 1 year after their first meeting, they stood together at Crestview Cemetery. The sun was shining. Fresh wildflowers, Laura's favorite, lay before the marble mausoleum. The air was peaceful. "She would be so proud of you, Natalie," Dawson said, his voice soft. "She'd be proud of you, Dawson," Natalie replied, looking at the man beside her. The harsh lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet strength and a sense of purpose. "You finally heard her song." Dawson looked at Laura's name, etched in gold, and for the first time in 2 years, his smile reached his eyes. The pain was still there, a scar on his soul, but it was no longer a chasm of emptiness. It was a testament to a love that was strong enough to echo after it was gone, a song of justice and redemption, carried on by the most unlikely of friends. The story of Dawson and Natalie shows us that true legacies aren't carved in stone or measured in stock prices, but in the secret acts of kindness that ripple out and change lives forever. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments of grief, a single connection can bring light, truth, and purpose. If this story of love, loss, and ultimate justice moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart and unexpected twists. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. We believe everyone has a story worth telling, and we're so grateful to have shared this one with you. Thank you for listening.